Penguin Random House Audio presents The Best Short Stories 2024, the O. Henry Prize winners. Guest editor, Amor Towles. Series editor, Jenny Minton Quigley. With an introduction by Amor Towles. Read for you by a full cast. In memory of Peter Matheson. Amor Towles.
Introduction. In serving as the judge of this year's O. Henry Prize, I have been reminded of the special role that surprise can play in the reading of a short story. For a variety of reasons, surprise is less significant in our experience of the novel. Often, when we begin to read a novel, we already know something of what it contains. After all, a description of the book is typically included right there on the dust jacket. Many reviewers in their published critiques rely heavily on synopsis. When friends recommend a novel or mention what they're reading in their book group, they will generally give us a sketch. And many novels we are drawn to read are already part of the cultural conversation, because they are revered classics or contemporary bestsellers. For all these reasons, when we pick up a novel and turn to the first page, before we start reading the opening sentence, we often have a sense of the journey on which we are about to embark. At minimum, we probably know whether the story takes place in the past, the present, or the future. We probably know where it is set, be that Paris or New York, the South or at sea. We may have a mental picture of the central character, and a general sense of the book's themes. In all likelihood, we already have identified the novel on a categorical matrix, having gleaned from various sources that it is either uplifting or tragic, comic or romantic, a page-turner or a slog. While the reality of this pre-awareness in no way undermines the pleasure or enrichment we can have from reading a novel, it does tend to diminish the overall role that surprise is going to play. But there is a more fundamental reason that our surprise is likely to be tempered when reading a novel, and that is because the artistic intention of the novelist tends to run counter to our experience of surprise. Practically speaking, novelists understand that a book detached from time and place, unclear in its direction, and obscure in its syntax, will only be tolerated by the typical reader for so many pages. Thus, it is rarely the intention of a novelist to mystify. Rather, in preparing the opening chapters of a novel, most authors, consciously or unconsciously, are trying to orient their readers. They are carefully describing the setting, establishing the times, and introducing the principal characters so that readers can venture forth into the narrative proper with a sense of context and confidence. Revisit any novel you admire, and you may be surprised to discover how much information the author imparts in the first 15 pages in order to situate you in the world of the story to come. Here, for example, are just the first 3 sentences of Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth. Selden paused in surprise. In the afternoon rush of the Grand Central Station, his eyes had been refreshed by the sight of Miss Lily Bart. It was a Monday in early September, and he was returning to his work from a hurried dip into the country. But what was Miss Bart doing in town at that season? What a bounty of information we receive from this brief passage. Geographically, we are in New York City, or more specifically, Manhattan. Temporally, we can sense the era in which the story is set from the fact that it is rush hour in a train station, and yet Selden refers to the woman he observes as Miss Lily Bart, a combination of modernism and quaintness that points to the early 20th century. Although we don't know it yet, Wharton has just introduced us to the book's 2 central characters, and given us critical insight into their situations. Of Selden, we know that he has a job, so he is not a man of leisure. But he has just spent the weekend dipping into the country, so he has the habits of the well-to-do. He appears to be single, he is traveling alone, and he is clearly attracted to the acquaintance whom he has happened upon by chance. As for Miss Bart, she is obviously unmarried, and apparently of that social class that has the liberty to leave the city for the entire summer. Finally, in this brief sketch, Wharton is giving us a glimpse of 2 of the novel's overarching themes: the influence of class in New York society, and the life of the unmarried woman as an object of public admiration, curiosity, and opinion. Alternatively, here are the first 3 sentences of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. At that time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses, built on the bank of a river of clear water that ran along a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous like prehistoric eggs. The world was so recent that many things lacked names, and in order to indicate them, it was necessary to point. Given the colonel's name, and the fact that Macondo was once made up of adobe houses, we can guess from Marquez's opening sentence that we are somewhere in Latin America. In the sentence, the author also alerts us that we are about to enter a saga that will span from that distant afternoon when the colonel was a boy, Macondo a village, and ice a novelty, through a period when the unnamed country is modernized enough to have a standing army, to many years later, a point at which political upheaval has led to firing squads. Tonally, Marquez introduces us to the magical realist style for which he is famous by fancifully referring to the colonel's childhood as a time when many things lacked names. And thematically, he reveals that the book we are about to read will be a tug-of-war between the traditional and the modern, between the individual and the state, and between memory and the historical record. But as in most novels, Wharton and Marquez do not rely on the first 3 sentences to orient their reader. They spend pages establishing our sense of the landscape and times. They give detailed descriptions of architectural spaces, the appearances and personalities of key characters, the interrelationships of families, prevailing socioeconomic factors, and events from the past that have bearing on the present. And much of this is laid out before anything of significance happens. The author's interest in orientation does not end with the first few chapters. Many of the aesthetic tools with which the novelist constructs meaning rely upon the reader's cumulative familiarity with characters, events, and images. To appreciate a story's narrative arc, the evolution of its protagonists, the layering of its interlinked events, and the resonance of its repeated motifs, readers must not only remember what they've read, but be constantly updating their sense of where they are in the tale. A final aspect of the novel that runs counter to the experience of surprise is the thematic power of inevitability. In the culminating chapters of a well-crafted novel, when the unexpected suddenly occurs, our initial surprise is usually followed quite quickly by a sense of the event's inevitability. Upon reflection, we realize that everything the author has laid out in the preceding pages, the family histories, the characters' personalities, the course of events, has led to the denouement inescapably. This prefiguring is the very essence of Shakespearean tragedy. The murder of Desdemona by Othello, the death of Hamlet at the hand of Laertes, the misguided suicides of Romeo and Juliet. These wrenching events are unavoidable outcomes. This is what separates them from instances of deus ex machina, when a problem intrinsic to a story is resolved unsatisfyingly through a sudden intervention, an unlikely occurrence, or the revelation of a new piece of information. Suffice it to say that inasmuch as surprise plays a role in the novel, it is a subservient one, diminished in its power thanks to reader pre-awareness, authorial orientation, and the dictates of narrative inevitability. What I have said in regard to the novel cannot so easily be said of the short story. First, it is quite unusual for us to begin a short story with a sense of what it is about. Whether we read the story in a periodical, an anthology, or an author's collection, we will not find a synopsis of it on the dust jacket. Most stories we encounter haven't been summarized in a review or sketched out for us by a recommending friend. Even when we consider the stories of the most revered practitioners, very few have entered the popular consciousness. And for those that have, Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, it is generally because they were taught to us in school. So when we read the opening sentence of most short stories, we are delightfully in the dark. Without the pre-awareness that accompanies novels, we don't know where or when the story is taking.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?